Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode in this series on unleashing your Microsoft 365 potential. In this episode, we're going to talk about how to find orphaned users inside your tenant. Let's start with some quick introductions. My name is Vlad Catrinescu. I'm a Microsoft MVP from Montreal, Canada. I authored some SharePoint books in the past. Now I do all my content on Pluralsight, and I'm joined today with my good friend Drew Madelung. How are you doing, Drew?
Great. Nice to see you again, Vlad. And my role in this world is I am a Microsoft 365 consultant. So I help a lot of organizations, especially some larger ones, working with and managing inside of Microsoft 365.
That's awesome, Drew. And Drew, what are we going to talk about in this episode? I know this is a topic that's near and dear to your heart.
So, Vlad, you and I both know we both come from SharePoint on-premises days. You and I met talking about SharePoint 2007, I think, when you were still a young lad. So today we're going to jump into more on, in this episode, we're going to talk all about orphan users. And the idea of orphan users comes from SharePoint. So this is going to be a very SharePoint-focused episode, where first we're going to talk about what orphan users are. We're going to go through the risk of orphan users in your environment. We're going to talk about what that means from an external perspective. If we're looking for introduction people, and how we're going to manage and control those users.
That sounds awesome, Drew. And just for everybody, we kind of mentioned this is episode 2. It's actually part of a 7-episode series. So if you haven't seen the first one yet, make sure you head over to the Siskit YouTube channel and check it out there. And of course, make sure you check out all the other upcoming episodes because this will be an amazing 7-episode series built for Microsoft 365 admin. So, Drew, let's get started.
And this was, I think, a great follow-up onto the last episode where we did talk about orphan workspaces. So today, we're going to be talking about orphan users. So there's a big difference between the orphan workspace conversation and the orphan user conversation. So an orphaned user is a SharePoint-specific concept where it is a primary account, so an account that no longer exists or is disabled, but it actually still exists in SharePoint. Okay, and that's a different concept than if you looked at anything compared to workspaces or teams or sites themselves. So this is going to be if I have an account, that account was in SharePoint, and then that account is no longer exists, primarily if it's deleted. So what's actually happening behind the scenes is that SharePoint has its own profile store. So when SharePoint Online and you have an account, an enter ID, and that account is removed, the account's deleted, or it could be unsynced if it's synced from your local directory. There's a user information list that sits in SharePoint, and that user could also be added to, let's say, a SharePoint group. Now, what actually happens is that Entra has its own sync engine that syncs user information into SharePoint Online. This has existed since, this is nothing new. This exists primarily in SharePoint on premises. It's where it was built. If anyone wants to talk about the user profile sync service, and there was you ever deal with it stuck on starting, you'll know where some of the history of this is. And that same concept exists in the cloud. We just don't ever have to manage it and deal with that anymore. But there is still a sync that occurs between Enter ID and the user objects there and the SharePoint Online profile store. And that gives you things like when I go and I create a file and you get created by, or if I add someone into a SharePoint group, not a Microsoft 365 group, a SharePoint group, it'll be using the profile information that comes from Enter ID. So there is a sync that exists behind those services. And again, this does not exist for M365, okay? Or M365 groups. So in episode 1, we talked all about M365 groups and workspaces and how people are added in and out. Now, you can have a Microsoft 365 group site, like a modern team site or a SharePoint team. Those still fully use SharePoint Online for file services. So you can use, like I could create a Microsoft team, I could invite Vlad, I could go into SharePoint, and I could actually start manipulating the SharePoint permission model there without following the M365 group itself for access. So I could, let's say, go into a list, break inheritance on that list, and start adding people if I wanted to. That's not necessarily the best practice. There are use cases where you want to do that, but realistically, that most likely is a scenario that you didn't intend to do. And what would happen then is if those accounts, let's say Vlad created a list, added a user named Brett, he goes in and then Brett's account's removed. Technically, there will be an object called Brett still sitting on that list because there was a sync that occurred. It does not go back and remove it. Now, I said Teams because all of these services also run on SharePoint. So SharePoint is the file services solution behind M365, supporting Teams, OneDrive. If you upload files into Viva Engage, it's actually uploading those all into SharePoint, which in turn you could have the scenario of an orphan user. So what would be the issue with that? What would be a concern if we have an orphan user? So the first thing, and the main one, is that permissions will stay applied to that user object, and it can cause confusion. Okay? So if I have a group, a SharePoint group, and I added an employee in there, and then that account was deleted, and I was coming in and I wanted to see who had access, I would say, why does Brett still have access to this list? Why does he still have access in this group? So it can cause confusion there. It's not actually a technical risk because that account's deleted, so they wouldn't be able to log back in and, let's say, breach or gather that content inappropriately because they can't get in. But behind the scenes, it does apply that idea. It applies that user object. And if it can definitely be confusing if people are familiar with SharePoint and starting to go see of who has access to my stuff, which is common, they want to know that their stuff is clean.
And we also we mentioned deleted. The account might also just be disabled, either for a limited number of time or for an indefinite period of time. The account could still technically exist in Enter ID, but the user might not be working for the company anymore. So we still call it orphaned if whether the user exists or not as an object, as long as they cannot physically or in theory sign in anymore.
Yeah. So if you're trying to look at those permissions and you say, who is this person here or what's there? Like, you just wouldn't know. So in this term, it's an orphan user inside of your SharePoint environment that you just that shouldn't be there. It doesn't need to be there. There are scenarios where you've seen since it is in your people picker, if you're building potentially your own solutions, it might even pull them back in. This especially existed more on premises where it will use that store and you don't necessarily need to have people pull back from them depending on that solution that you're working with. Out of the box, it won't. Like if I go file share, it will not. But there are scenarios when you get into more custom solutions that will use that as a object. The one I run into a lot is I run a lot of migrations is unnecessary errors. So if you're working with this, especially on premises, and you're migrating to the cloud and you start to do these migrations, you might have a plethora of errors. If you're running, let's say, older versions of SharePoint, you've never cleaned it up once. You will get a lot of scenarios of, I try to migrate this account that says Brett had access, Brett does not exist anymore. So they try to migrate it and you get an error saying can't be found. The reason that's a concern is that it's a red herring, right? It's, it's going to be an error, but it will actually diminish or make it harder to find actual errors if you start to become nuanced or accept all the errors we receive as part of migration with something like that. So not a risk, but visually can be deceiving to see that.
And I think a lot of times as we move to the cloud, we think, hey, we're on our final migration. We never have to migrate anymore. At least that's what we hope for, right? But the reality is that mergers and acquisitions happen, things like that, or simply restructuring inside the same organization, it happens. And even if we might be in the same company, in the same entity, when we need to migrate content from a site to another, a lot of the times we're still going to use a migration tool. We're still going to use the same concept of migration, try to migrate permissions, everything. And that's when error happens. I know that a lot of time I talk to people and they're like, yeah, well, I don't care about migration problems because I'm never migrating again. Well, never say never. It still happens a lot. And I think now just that we see different migrations. Instead of on-prem to the cloud, we see tenant to tenant migrations a lot more often.
They're one of the most common things I've been working on these days is whether it's consolidation or people calling their tenant a funny name and wanting to move to they buy another tenant. They had multiple at one point in time. There's smaller reasons that I've seen come through. And it's definitely one of the pains of having an orphan user here. And this does apply to guest accounts. So I said external. So if you are working with guests and you're doing some very detailed, more, I'd say, advanced SharePoint work, this is not, I would say, important if you're working in just general external collaboration where I'm adding a person to a team or I'm adding them to a whole SharePoint site. Not as much of a concern. But if I start to get into some more advanced extranet scenarios, and if I want to think about access reviews for guests, which we'll talk about in future episodes, these won't fit into that mold, right? These are going to be orphaned users that are just objects that sit on a SharePoint site that are not going to be cleaned as part of an access review. So there is external impact to that. They're not actually going to have access to it again. But if I'm a user and if I start to, let's say, have an extranet that might have some sensitive data, and I go and see that there is an external user object on that from a permission report, that's it. I could be concerned about that, even though there's no risk. It's a visual pain to have that exist while looking at it. So what does this look like? So what this looks like is I'm going to go into SharePoint. So this is still, this is actually on Microsoft, so I'm going to kick it back. This is a Microsoft 365 site. So it's on a site called Team Site here. So you see up on the left, it's a regular modern team site in Microsoft 365. You'll see I have my membership up here with people that have permissions into this group. If I come in here and I go into site permissions, up here on the top right, and I go down here into the advanced permission settings, this is the way to manage permissions from a SharePoint perspective in Microsoft 365. Now, this screen, if you've worked in SharePoint on premises or have SharePoint history before modern, this is the same screen we've seen for years. And the same architecture exists behind the scenes for group or permission management through groups, or permission management granted directly to user objects on a site or on a object. So I could say I could grant access to a single user for this site, or I could add them into a group and use the SharePoint group throughout the artifacts on the site. So let's say I could go to the document library and I could share just the document library, or I could add them into a group and it would all inherit down. So the idea of SharePoint groups still exists behind the scenes in Microsoft 365. So what actually happened is if I'm adding people into a M365 group, you're going to see that we're actually adding them into what's called, in this one, group 2. And you're going to see up here, that's actually the name of this group. So I'm adding people into that Microsoft 365 group, which then in turn is granting them contribute access in this team, which you're going to see there's something different here as well. There's one called delete me. And I could go even into my owners group and you can see something the same way. If I look at this owners group, there is a user object here called delete me. This actually doesn't exist. Even though if I go look at like the user information list, which is a hidden list on your SharePoint site that if you ever want to see people who have had access to it or worked with inside of it, there's also a delete me object in here. If I go into it, I can actually see information about it. So it still has profile information right here that exists. But if I go into enter ID and I look for the word delete, you're going to see I have 0 users found. Click refresh again. There are no users in my organizational directory that have the word delete. So what this means is that the delete me user, it's called delete me right here, is still listed as a user object inside of the SharePoint group team site owners, even though it doesn't exist in enter ID. So these next to each other, which you're going to see right here, is that it exists here. It is not here. So this is an orphan user inside of this site. Right? That's the concern that we're looking at covering here. So if I was ever curious who had access to my site, if I came here just as a user, I would think delete me has access to it, even though they don't exist. So it can be confusing from reporting. It can be confusing from a user browsing to it. And it's simply a artifact that's left behind due to a provisioning process that exists between the two services. So what can we do about that? What can we do? Unfortunately, there are no built-in solutions for this. Right? So this has existed since SharePoint on premises. That still does exist in SharePoint on premises. There is not a process for it. And again, there's not necessarily a technical risk, right? It's not like that delete me account could come and get access, but it is a visual pain to look at. So what can we do? The main thing we like to work with is, and if I work with organizations, is using scripting to do this. So there is an example that we can use SharePoint Online PowerShell to get this information. The main thing you'll be looking at is going to be, how do we find the user IDs to go remove? And then we just need to run the remove SPO user, and it will remove that user from that site. So what we actually have to do, the first thing we would do is we would have to loop through all the site collections. So you can run get SPO site and loop through all the site collections to gather them. And what you'll then do is per site, you'll grab that and say get SPO user, and that will pull the user objects from that site. So it would say delete me and all the other, let's say all the other users I had in that UIL. And then you're going to use the graph PowerShell to go check if that user exists, or to Vlad's point, if it's disabled. Right? So you can even get to the level of starting to do some of your own permission pulling based on the user object itself. So get your sites, get the users per site, loop through and validate for each of those users and check if they exist. If they don't exist, run a remove SP user to remove that delete me object from that site.
I also wanted to add a quick note, Drew. You have it on the slide there. You should use the graph PowerShell for this. If any of you still have PowerShell scripts that use the Azure AD PowerShell module, or even older, the MS Online PowerShell module, man, that brings memories. But if you have any scripts that use those, remember, those will be deprecated starting in March 2024. They'll still work for a while after, but at some point they're going to stop being supported. They're going to stop working. So if you ever have any scripts that use those old modules, make sure you upgrade them to the graph PowerShell module.
And I like thinking of this as for a cadence, this does not need to be that frequent, weekly, monthly, quarterly, at least even doing it before a migration. These are things that you can do to go make sure that your environment is as clean as possible as you proceed throughout your managing your Microsoft 365 environment. Now, the last one, which is a viable solution here, is going to be a third-party solution. There are such as Syskit, which we'll talk about, but there are solutions out there that use this same idea to come in and scan through and loop through the information that you have in your, to get rid of some of these orphan users for you. There are a few other things that we want to think about. As Vlad mentioned, you have the idea of inactive users and disabled users can also be seen as this. Think about how you manage your inactive accounts, which we'll talk again about in other episodes here. But an inactive account can also be, if you do a graph check on it, it might not be, you might need to decide on the time of when inactive is real or not. You'll have to decide that for yourself. Disabled, same thing. There could be disabled for a very short period of time. You need to plan for that risk. You don't want to just go remove access for certain people because they've been disabled for a day. So there's thresholds you need to be careful with, but these are ones you want to check depending on your situation. So I would say export and find the orphan users you have now, and then go back and look that are disabled, inactive, or no longer exist, and then do a comparison against actual dates. So be a little bit careful, but you can go deeper than simply a deleted account, as I mentioned. You can include inactive guests. So we'll talk about that in a future video about how we can start to manage inactive guest account in your environment. And there are deletion processes that you can work with an Entra ID versus simply disabling. So if you have a concern about disabling, there are some organizations I work with, they disable everything. That can make it challenging to come back and figure out which ones are actually supposed to be disabled for a period of time versus permanently. That adds confusion. So if you start to deleting accounts, that is cleaner to find which ones are actually supposed to be removed versus not. If we are, when working in these workspaces, like in SharePoint, if we start to expire workspaces and expire our SharePoint sites, it limits our usage of orphan user potential. So there's always concern about sprawl. By having expiration policies, it also helps clean up your orphan users. If you are still on premises, I would recommend doing this prior to a migration. It is beneficial to have this information removed. You see it more in your on-premises migration. We are seeing a lot of tenant to tenants, but it does come through a lot visually from the on-premises, as normally that's been not cleaned up for in a very extended period of time, and there has not been any deletion policies that exist. But with that, these are the scenarios that you can come through. One of the areas I did talk about using is SysKit. So SysKit is thankfully brought us here together to talk about this. They are a wonderful tool to go help discover and manage your M365 environment, including the orphan user scenario here. And if you are interested, you can start a 21-day free trial. I highly recommend doing that. And Vlad, anything else you want to add around?
I think this is a perfect example where creating a script yourself is something that will take quite a bit of time to create and maintain the script by yourself, especially that you have to interact in SharePoint, you have to interact with Graph PowerShell, you have to run it on a schedule, create all of that. Whereas you can have a third-party tool such as Syskit do it all for you and have all the reports and just take care of it for you without you having to build anything. So like Drew said, make sure you check out, you get a 21-day free trial, and you can use it to find out how many orphaned users you have in your tenant right now. So even if you just use the trial, go check it out. It might tell you a lot of information you don't know about your tenant. But I think, Drew, this is it for this episode. Uh, Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And make sure you join us in our next episode where we talk about how to reclaim licenses and make sure you don't have any licenses in your tenant that you pay for, but that nobody is using. So thank you very much again for watching, and see you soon.
Thank you.